We're going to allow folks to trickle in, and then we can get started. Okay, let's do this. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Kay from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Avgi Saketopoulou, presenting her new book, Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, and Traumatophilia. She'll be talking with Tavia Nyong'o and Amber Jamilla Musser, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Avgi, Tavia, Amber, and the team at New York University Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Couple of quick housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Sexuality Beyond Consent, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we are offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. Our panelists tonight are Tavia Nyong'o and Amber Jamilla Musser. Tavia Nyong'o is Chair and William Lamson Professor of Performance Studies, American Studies, African American Studies, and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. His books include The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and The Ruses of Memory and Afro-Fabulations, The Queer Drama of Black Life. Amber Jamilla Musser is the professor of English at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, sexuality, and aesthetics. She is the author of Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism, Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity and Brown. I should have asked how to pronounce this word. It's a new word for me. Amber's got herself on mute. Let's hear it, Amber.
Jouissance.
Jouissance. Learned a new word, everybody. And the forthcoming Between Shadows and Noise, Sensation, Situatedness, and the Undisciplined. Man, y'all are giving me a workout. They will be speaking with our featured author, Avgi Saketopoulou. Dr. Saketopoulou is an immigrant Cypriot and Greek psychoanalyst living and working in NYC. She is on faculty at the NYU postdoctoral program, where she also trained and teaches nationally in several psychoanalytic institutes. Her published work has received numerous prizes, and when she is not working, she rides her motorcycle, hoping for good weather. Avgi's new book, Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, and Traumatophilia, is an analysis of our culture's hyper-focus on healing sexual trauma that raises the need to reroute our attention to what subjects do with their trauma. Moving between clinical and cultural case studies, Saketopoulou takes up theatrical and cinematic works such as Slave Play and The Night Porter, to demonstrate how the force of the erotic surges through aesthetic domains. Avgi is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Tavia and Amber and with all of you. So please take it away, Avgi.
Thank you, Kay, for the introduction, and thank you to Greenlight for having us. Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Tavia, for joining me in this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about the book with you. Okay, I'm going to read from chapter 3 in the book, and this segment comes after a long discussion of slave play, which is a theatrical piece that I'm very, very preoccupied with in this book. Okay. So there is no question that slave play is pornographic. There is nudity, there's simulated sex, there are sex toys, there's orgasm. But naming it as such has been difficult for many audiences. This difficulty is not entirely surprising. Far too often, Nash writes, quote, "The word black in front of the word pornography is treated as an intensifier, as something that produces political anxiety rather than as something that can engender theoretical energy and analytical sophistication," unquote. It is no wonder that the play's director, Robert O'Hara, decided to manage the audience's anxiety by withholding an intermission, rightly anticipating that anyone made uncomfortable by the demanding horrors of the first act, that is, anyone with a pulse, would be tempted to walk away. The lack of an intermission, though, did not prevent this from happening. Offended theatergoers still got up and left during the first act, broadcasting their displeasure by passive-aggressively gathering their belongings as if in slow motion before heading for the exit. Audience members who walked away were mostly Black, as were the majority of those who voiced their upset on social media, podcasts, and online reviews. The gist of this protest was similar to Alice Walker's 1971 commentary on an interracial lesbian couple involving a white mistress and a Black self-identified slave. Quote, "I was incensed to think of the hard struggle of my students to rid themselves of stereotype, to combat prejudice, to put themselves into enslaved women's skins, and then to see their struggle mocked, and the actual enslaved condition of literally millions of our mothers trivialized because two ignorant women insisted on their right to act out publicly a quote-unquote fantasy that still strikes terror in Black women's hearts," unquote. The combination of sex, trauma, and degradation played out through racial tropes is not easy to bear. But, O'Hara explains, if you go to see a play that calls itself slave play, quote, "it should cost you something to watch it and to experience it," unquote. What exactly the price to be paid is, he does not tell us. But the lack of intermission suggests that it may have something to do with subjecting the audience to an intensification that one is not allowed to escape. The audience has consented to watching slave play without knowing how relentless or intense it will be. And the play's demand tracks differently across theatergoers depending on their psychic makeup, personal history, and intersecting positionalities. Built into the force of this performance is a particular kind of sadism that I call exigent and describe as ethical. The audience is given neither a rest nor the time to recover from the first act's intensities. And while there's not intent to inflict harm per se, some theatergoers did feel injured and traumatized. The play unfolds such that the audience is prevented from easily rationalizing its enjoyment. We might say that the play exerts an ethical kind of sadism that is exigent in that it issues a necessary and imperative call to the audience to endure something difficult, something that will challenge them through its intensity and by means of what it repeats. Theatergoers who are able to bend their will, that is, to stay in the theater and to give themselves over to the play rather than trying to control their reactions or inhibit their pleasure, might then be able to endure an aesthetic experience that both strains and excites, calling something forth in them, something that can be perverse and overwhelming. I'm going to jump and read just one more passage from the end of the play. And this is from the closing line of the play, where the main character says something extremely, that has generated a lot of conversation in commentary around the play, and which I think is a really interesting endpoint. This follows on a scene that is extremely hard to decode as to deciding what has happened, whether it's ethical, whether it's pleasurable, where it lands on the domain of violation, consent, and engagement. And it can go either way on different nights. The line is the actress who plays the main character, Kanisha, ends the play with saying, "Thank you, baby, thank you for listening." The play's ending leaves the audience unsure as to what Kanisha means and for whom, if anyone, she is addressing. Is her tone grateful, ironic, enraged? In the most obvious way, Jim listened to her need to be racially humiliated, delivering the sexual scene that she had been requesting from the very start and which he had been resisting throughout the play. But on another level, following a discussion earlier in the book on Fred Moten and his idea of listening not to grasp the other, but as a form of dispossession, Jim's listening may have more to do with tuning into the aesthetics of the terribly beautiful in himself. Perhaps what Jim was finally able to do is eavesdrop on himself, listening towards his own disruption, to encounter something in him which he had so far resisted, something opaque and something that makes him vomit. There are not many stage directions in the script of Slave Play, but regarding this particular closing line, the playwright Jeremy O. Harris instructs thus, quote, "The actress playing Kanisha does whatever she feels is right before looking at him," Jim, unquote. Built into the script is the awareness that the Black actress playing Kanisha needs a way out of being crushed by the exacting difficulties of the scene. The actress, Harris recognizes, is not pretending. She's not just acting. To enact her role, she needs to let forces be roused in her that are difficult and demonic, forces that are actual rather than simulated or mimetic. Quote, "I ask a Black actress to get on her knees and twerk while eating a cantaloupe," unquote, Harris says. And that's an insane thing, he continues, to ask someone not to pretend to do, but to actually do, unquote. The instruction to deliver the closing line thus, doing whatever the actress feels is right for her, empowers the actress to translate the script's last line in a way that she needs to, bringing it into her own emotional idiom. "I wanted," Harris says, "to give an opportunity to an actress to have the sort of versatility inside of a character that I've only seen white actresses given an opportunity to have," unquote. In inciting the crisis that leads to the end of the play, yet authorizing the actress to translate freely, Harris grants his protagonist the full spectrum of her humanity. Antoinette Crowe Legacy, the actress playing Kanisha in the August Wilson production, describes the closing line as such. This is what she says. "This is the one part of the play where I don't feel responsible to anyone. I don't feel responsible to the audience. I don't feel responsible to the story. It's just me and Kanisha, and we're going to have our moment. It's the one moment that's just for us. It's just for us."
Thank you, Avgi. I think that I'm next up in terms of a response, so I'm just going to jump into it. I prepared some written remarks, which I will deliver. So happy to be here. When asked to respond to the launch of Sexuality Beyond Consent by Avgi Saketopoulou, I went into an unusual mode for me, the confessional. No doubt this swerve out of my comfort zone, where I stand before you today, has something to do with the psychoanalytic register of this book, written by a practicing clinician as well as a gifted theorist. While we live in the heyday of auto theory, much of what I read and much of which I read, admire, and teach, my stance has long been auto theory for thee, but not for me. I do not feel enough of an authority on my own experience to make it the routine source of discursive claims, and I've often felt that some, though of course not all, auto theory lacks a robust enough grasp of our opacity to ourselves, upon which grasp any account of experiences should be premised. Not that Sexuality Beyond Consent is a work of auto theory, at least I don't think it is. While rigorously based in psychoanalytic papers and published in a series devoted to queer theory and queer of color critique, it is rather something that I think will eventually require a new designation entirely, insofar as what is staged in its pages is a surprisingly fresh encounter between queer theory and psychoanalysis, one that employs the categories of risk, race, and traumatophilia to rescue those old bedfellows, queer theory and psychoanalysis, from the anhedonia of their long cohabitation. Am I hinting that Avgi Saketopoulou with this book is exposing our field to something like the antebellum sexual performance therapy that is satirized in the play about which many pages of this text are devoted? More on this possibility later. I should back up and say that ever since I began reading psychoanalysis at age 17, the age when I first encountered Sigmund Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, I have been utterly, devastatingly convinced. I mention this as a disclaimer insofar as most people I encounter seem to be skeptical, present company accepted, of course. Most people seem to be skeptical of both psychoanalysis and people who say they believe in it. Reading and being convinced by psychoanalysis is by no means my only secret shame, but it is one of them. That my first imprinting of psychoanalysis came from a particular book originally titled Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, or The Uneasiness in Culture, is significant, insofar as it has shaped an intellectual orientation that has remained, despite what some of my less careful readers have claimed, pessimistic. The Pessimism of Civilization and Its Discontents, a book written in 1928 as Freud reckoned with both the devastating aftermath of the Great War and, on a personal level, with the cancer diagnosis that would eventually claim his life in 1939, was articulated in the book's claim that social efforts to decrease unhappiness had the paradoxical effect of increasing unhappiness at the psychic level. When I say that this argument was devastating to a 17-year-old me, however, I do not mean it made me unhappy. It was rather something that felt, to risk adopting a term provided for by a clinical vignette in Avgi's book, like an exquisite slap. I read it in a class on social theory, and I wanted a theory of the social. But when I found one that felt so exquisitely right, it hurt. It hurts. It smarts. That the source of my exquisite devastation was not that of a sadomasochistic sexual encounter, but a reading of a book of social theory probably tells you something about the patterns of my own sublimation, but that is probably a tale for the couch if ever I get there. Like Civilization and Its Discontents, Sexuality Beyond Consent was written to ruin a certain progressive myth, one we may aptly summarize as the ego-psychological obsession with secure attachment and affirmative consent. But where Freud bemoaned the mechanism whereby culture subjects the obedient to a deadening battery of neuroses as the price for her not being declared mad, bad, or worse, Saketopoulou turns instead to eroticism and the aesthetic as domains wherein the subject may come to transient life. Self-sovereignty in this striking redescription of experience by way of Laplanche and Glissant, many others, is temporary relief from the demands of relationality, whose civilizational demands to be a good subject that never subsides, even as society grows ostensibly more liberal tolerant, and diverse. These spaces of, maybe this is captured in the odd phenomenon of the unprecedented numbers of nominations of slave play in various awards, coupled with its inability to win a single one. There was something intolerable about this, even as it was difficult to say why. These spaces of eroticism and the aesthetic, Saketopoulou warns, are increasingly prescribed by the ego's psychological obsession with the kinds of transparency and wholeness upon which a transactional capitalistic relationality depends. This results in what she terms a traumatophobic orientation to the enigmatic signifiers we encounter in the unconscious, signifiers that move around in our psychic life. Anhedonia, the rising affect of our sex recession, is a cultural symptom of the psychic exhaustion with the superegoic demands of capitalism's death drive, which can be found in the fundamentally extractive relationship in which minoritarian subjects increasingly find ourselves as we face places of work, leisure, and intimacy within which we are expected to show up as our whole, authentic selves. If this all sounds like another way of saying society today is a dumpster fire, then you are not far off from the point about trauma that Saketopoulou is setting up for you to comprehend. While Sexuality Beyond Consent is here to ruin the progressive myth that we can ever heal or get beyond our trauma, this is actually good news insofar as, according to the Laplanchian technique of psychoanalysis that she practices, trauma, quote, needs to circulate. It needs to be revisited, unquote. The attitude of, quote, maintaining a hospitable attitude towards the revisitation of trauma, unquote, is what she means by traumatophilic. At this point, and in keeping with the confessional mode, I should offer a disclaimer. Like many theorists attuned to the psychoanalytic worldview, I have myself been neither a psychoanalyst nor an analysand. I am, for lack of a better word, the unanalyzed. Yet if there is one thing that excites me most about this ménage à trois between queer theory, queer of color critique, and psychoanalysis, is that it means that I do not have to be the subject supposed to know about psychoanalysis. But neither, I discover when I speak my relief into this room, do I relish being the subject supposed to know about queer theory, or even about queer of color critique, although given the current political assault on that area of study, I am sorely tempted. There is something about appearing before you as an expert in any of these domains that is, if not anhedonic, then a bit decathecting. And to explain that little bit of enigmatic speech, I perhaps need to end my remarks by explaining a bit more of my relationship to a play that I hope we will be talking about, we already are talking about today, Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play. To quote the late, great Richard Pryor, what had happened was, in 2016, after a season of grief, intense grief, I began a new life as a professor of performance studies at Yale University, where I still teach. In my graduate seminar on Black critical theory that fall, I encountered a playwriting student who immediately impressed himself and the whole campus with his presence. This was Jeremy. In seeking admission to my seminar, he made the following proposal. He would attend and do the readings, but he would submit a play as his final paper. This was a choose your own adventure moment for me, since I did not then know how to give feedback on playwriting beyond the type of cheerleading any proud parent would offer. I chose to follow Jeremy wherever his errant and wild imagination was taking him and me. And in October of the following year, while I was on sabbatical in Los Angeles, Slave Play was produced on campus. Upon my return to the East Coast, Jeremy invited me to the premiere of the off-Broadway production in November 2018, and I saw it again the following October on Broadway. While Jeremy has sometimes been so kind as to introduce me as his favorite teacher at Yale, I feel certain that this flattery is offered to me only because I was, at that time, among his most inept, the teacher least able to offer the kind of useful feedback that he, luckily, received from my colleagues at the drama school, from his classmates, from the superlative group of dramatists at the New York Theater Workshop and on Broadway, and especially the legendary playwright and director Robert O'Hara. The only thing I could give him was the only thing it turned out he needed from me, and that was to believe in him. And the rest, as we know, is theater history. Throughout the period of Slave Play's remarkable success, I have faced one looming question about it. One question people ask: what did you think? What did you think? Until I read Sexuality Beyond Consent, I didn't understand why I could never answer this question. I understood it, but I could not answer it. I had thoughts about slave play. I have thoughts about almost everything, except for sports, but I couldn't speak them to you. I was implicated. To speak about Jeremy's play publicly felt like a violation. Even now, I admit, it feels like a violation, like a form of speaking without any safety net. What is this inhibition I feel against telling you what I think about slave play, attached to nothing, if not an exorbitant but quite mundane excitation of pride and wonder in the accomplishment of a former student? Is it perhaps, I wonder, an ego defense against what Saketopoulou calls overwhelm? So, what did I think about slave play? Happily, today, I may announce, read Sexuality Beyond Consent and find out. With its publication, I can delegate my thinking to Avgi, who has thought so long and so carefully about this play as to have earned, if not the last word on it, at least the first. I still cannot say what I think, but I can say what I have felt. I felt overwhelmed, but I did not feel traumatized. And while reading the play and watching it, never felt like bending my will. As Avgi theorizes that process, talking about it does. That is why reading Sexuality Beyond Consent, to bend Avgi's words against her, feels to me like a, quote, rare and fortunate moment when an encounter with another or an encounter with art or performance may work on us at the very site of experience, enabling the actual to represent itself and the traumatic to reappear, unquote. If fear of the reappearance of the traumatic is so often the monitor against stepping outside of one's comfort zone, I'm only reassured that in so stepping into the confessional mode, I have recruited so able an analyst to encounter it with. Maybe auto theory will prove viable for me after all.
Tavia, thank you for your confessions. I am going to be speaking a little bit more off the cuff because I am tired. That's my confession. But I just want to say that one of the, by way of kind of stumbling into what I think is, there's so many profound gifts that this book gives us. And one of the ones that, Avgi names at the very end of the book, but I'm going to foreground here, is really a way to think about sadism. And so I announced this as somebody who wrote a whole book about masochism. And my book about masochism was about the ways that we can use it, and people have used it to think about intersections of power, race, and sexuality. And sort of the entanglement that most people think most robustly with is BDSM, and sadism kind of drops out of the picture. One of my arguments in that book was that masochism kind of provides a lingua franca for thinking about liberal subjectivity because it relies on concepts like recognition and the notion of transparency and possession and sort of things like that. And one of the amazing things about this book is that we get a glimpse of what happens if life was ordered otherwise, which is to say, if life was ordered through sadism. And I think that that's a thing that we don't often get to think about. And for me, one of the beautiful things that this book does in that kind of promotion of thinking about exigent sadism, which hopefully Avgi will tell us more about. I mean, I heard more about this last night, but I think all of you would like to hear more about this. But one of the things that it really does is really, I think, especially for our moment, it feels like we're really caught in a lot of quagmires around how to think about race and racialization. And this shift away from recognition and this shift outside of the particular dynamics of woundedness that masochism kind of traffics in, towards sort of, towards risk, towards openness, towards really, being in the space of relation that sadism kind of of relation and responsibility that sadism demands, I think gives us a new language to think about race in our particular moment that we need in a really profound way. And it's, so I want us to think, collectively about kind of what that means. One of the ways that I think the book makes this clear, I don't want to say like clearest because it comes up throughout, but is often in books about race, people will talk about racialized people and not so much about the races of other people or sort of how racialization happens in those formations. And Sexuality Beyond Consent really brings the forces of race and sort of like the responsibilities and sort of the power dynamics to bear on everybody, and especially whiteness. So I think thinking about the way that whiteness becomes a site of intense analysis in the same way that BDSM is, in the same way that Blackness is also a really important intervention. And then sort of, I'm not good with, when I'm tired, I'm really bad with transitions. So it's like, and another thing, but alongside that sort of like that refiguration of race, I think we also get a really interesting refiguration of temporality, where in the overwhelm, we kind of get this, I want to call it like a compression. I think because I've been thinking a little bit about the Oscars, it's also a little bit of an everything, everywhere, all at once type of thing, where it's just sort of these moments that again disrupt so much of what we thought about temporality, where it's supposed to progress either with trauma toward healing, but in all sorts of different ways that focus on sort of the what is, where one is and what is now is really a profound mode of being in time, in space, with people, right? So I'm just sort of interested in sort of how those nodes are, I think, offshoots of sadism as kind of the orienting principle, and then how art becomes part of this, right? So I'm hopeful, like Tavia, that we will go back to talking about slave play, but I'm going to throw in another sort of piece of art that also generated a lot of kind of what are you doing to me, which is Kara Walker's Sugar Sphinx, where a lot of people experienced that. And I think the takeaway was not the overwhelm that Avgi, that you talk about in the book, right, where you sort of transformed. It was a lot of people really walking away and being like very upset by being placed in this position. So I think I'm thinking kind of about how we can, what are the conditions of the art that produce this kind of overwhelm, and sort of, what needs to be in place for that. So I'm gonna go back to open it to you guys to.
Wow, like, thank you so much, both. Like, how I have so many thoughts about what you're both raising, and I'm really struck that both of you are kind of like coming at the notion of self-sovereignty, kind of like from different angles. And I'm really delighted that you're kind of like fishing that out of the book, because it's something that I think could get overlooked. And I think it's really, really central to some of the points that I'm making. So should I jump in and maybe I'll jump in and make a few comments about what you were saying, and then I know that you also have some questions, and we'll go from there. So I was thinking, Tavia, about you kind of like bringing up like the 12 Tonys and the 0 earned, the 12 nominations and 0 Tonys, which I think is kind of like so emblematic of the kinds of intensities that this play courts, and also the anxieties that it rouses, which I think it's kind of how it works. I think that if it works because it vibrates on that kind of like intense precipice where maybe you fall in, maybe you don't. Like, you know, people who have become enthralled with a play or interested in the play kind of like usually stand over that cliff, and they don't step back and kind of like lean in a little bit. And I was thinking about your question, Amber, about kind of like talking about Kara Walker. And kind of like people walking away and not having that experience, and people walked away from slave play as well. And of course, you know, it's hard to like make a general statement about why that might be. And of course, either of you will be surprised to hear me say that I think that people who walk away are also resisting something in themselves, resisting whatever they're being called forth into. But I do have a thought about the kind of like the Kara Walker exhibit, and like somebody whose work I also really love. And I think there's something about performance and about the durational aspect of performance, especially a performance like this one that has no intermission, and which actually is really, I think, I will very intentionally say, it's a mindfuck, and it's intended to be a mindfuck. It kind of like takes you into the disaster. It hurls you out into a space where you think you understand what's going on, and maybe you have like some insights, quote unquote insights, kind of like where you get to feel good about yourself, like, okay, you're stabilized, and then it just throws you into the abyss. And there's something about kind of like these energetic shifts that happen so quickly and with such intensity. And if you've stayed past the first act, you're kind of like in for the ride. You're kind of like more on a roller coaster than you are appreciating it or taking it in or reflecting on it. And I think there's something about performance that kind of like comes at you and acts on you in a way that is harder to resist. Like, you can, of course, you know, like there's another moment in another interview where Robert O'Hara says, he's explaining why he has no intermission. And he says, I kind of want to see you choke. He actually says that, which is like really exciting, because of course he wants to see you choke. Like, this should not come as a surprise. But he also has, I think, the integrity to say it, which takes us to this whole question of sadism. Like, there's something about saying, like, I want you to stay there, but he cannot force you to stay there. Like, if you stay there, you're only staying there because he's seduced you. He and Jeremy have seduced you. Goes back to kind of like what you were saying about his tremendous talent, and kind of like, you know, somebody walks onto a campus and says, how about we do this my way, right? But he also can pull that off, right? So it's not just like the arrogance or entitlement of somebody who's like, I don't want to play by your rules. It's also somebody who actually can pull that off. So you're seduced into kind of like transfixed through you. I mean, you may not be transfixed, but I'm talking about my experience of the play and people who became very interested in it. Kind of like you're transfixed into a particular place from which you kind of like, you're in it, and you're, as you said, Tavi, I think that's a key word, like you're implicated. Like, you don't get to be outside, and you can watch it as entertainment. And then I think that that's a very violent way of watching that play. It's more about possessing it and consuming it and trying to control it and control yourself. But if you're kind of like giving yourself over to it, you're implicated. And that implicated is not gonna, it cannot be settled with acknowledgements or kind of like recognitions of like, I as a white person or from my positionality such, it just will not let you do that. And I think that's what I find interestingly sadistic about the play. And I speak about sadism in the book, I should make this very clear, as a form of care, as a particular way of holding somebody. And I have a very elaborate sequence in the book where I explain a little bit about kind of like the history of the concept of sadism and how kind of like it starts out kind of like in the works of the Marquis de Sade, where we first encounter it as a way of thinking about a variety of different phenomena, and kind of like it gets taken up with a lot of admiration by political philosophers, political theorists and philosophers, and kind of like he's seen as having anticipated Freud and Havelock Ellis. And then around World War II, something really shifts in that discourse. And he's now seen as having anticipated the atrocities of the Holocaust, kind of like mass torture. He doesn't get taken up in thinking about slavery because that's not the discourse that is interested, like that's like kind of like Western philosophy, it does not go in that direction. But something shifts in that. And part of what the Sade also gives us that gets lost in that are the beginnings of a sense of sovereignty, which you were both speaking about, kind of like these very transient moments, like Tavia, the phrase that you used that was really beautiful was like transient life, kind of like these kind of like really these bursts of intense experience that are divested of identity relation, and they're fleeting, they come, they feel like an elongated moment, and then they go away very quickly as the ego reorganizes itself. But that's a kind of experience that I'm trying to speak about. I think it's the experience that the ego resists when it says, this exhibit, no, not for me, I don't like that, I'm walking away.
Could I jump in on that just quickly? There's another, I'm resisting to flip through and cite chapter and verse, but you probably know the moment in the text where you say something to the effect of a kind of like really stern talking to on the stage might leave us gasping with shame, but rarely leaves us aroused with the energies. It kind of really spoke to me because not only I agree, if you go to slave play for entertainment, you really are missing the point, but also a good entertainment in a certain way. But also if you're going for it for like good politics in a way, you're also, I think that was part of the problem. People really wanted or expected Black art today to sort of produce a kind of right on politics and which is also the challenge of Kara Walker's work since it came on the scene. In addition to Kara Walker, there's another performer, Rodney McMillian, who has been, some people may know, he's been doing a performance or a re-performance of a Clarence Thomas valedictory address from the mid-'80s that just is itch wild. Like in terms of like an unhinged, it's really just, McMillian is not I guess he's a performance artist, not primarily a performance artist, right? But he just does this, reenactment of a figure that most of us encounter as monstrous, right? Particularly, in the last year with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but long before, and he is not embellishing. It's his documentary theater. He's really just re-performing Clarence Thomas's words given before a historically Black university in the South. It's I kind of brought that up just to think about the work that, the advantage of that piece is that no one goes in expecting good politics from Clarence Thomas. So again, you've signed up, but you're also not allowed to just, you're implicated, you're implicated. I felt implicated as a Black audience member in the, the performative contract that, that McMillian was staging in that piece. The other, just to go back to slave play though as well, I really feel that Claire Warden, the intimacy director, deserves a mention in this context. And again, as someone who's been more of like an outside, I've sort of been kind of drawn into theater mob, it's like I keep trying to get it out, they keep pulling me, and so I've had to learn a lot about, and so like who knew that like intimacy direction was like a thing, and that it actually overlaps with like fight direction, that there is in the field of performance, there's this total overlap in like in the production, right, between violence and sex. It's just straight up the same person, right? And you have to untangle it and retangle it. And when you're working with students, we hire, these fight and violence directors, as we say somewhat jokingly, but somewhat seriously, like they come for the fighting, but we have to like teach them the intimacy too. So it's like they have to stay for the first semester and learn how to like, touch appropriately before they can get to the like, swords and guns, etc. That is an important dimension, because one of the things that you quote her as saying in your book, Avgi, is that that her work with I'm not paraphrasing too incorrect, too loosely, that her work with the actors is not to make them feel safe, but to allow them to be human, right? Which is also that point in the reading of Kanisha that you gave. It's like, and which again is not to say that is a toll-free experience for the actors, like in my limited opportunities to talk to some of the actors, like any play, right? There is a toll to performing in this play as well as a reward. But that idea that performance brings out, particularly for racialized, minoritarian, my goodness, like an actor with a set of attachments or experiences with BDSM or slave play, or race play, I can only, it does, yeah. So I just shout out in some ways to intimacy direction as a kind of field that is, that's also a queer and feminist field within a space of directing for stage and screen that is very traditionally white and patriarchal. I guess we should say that, so intimacy directors actually get in there and get to have a conversation that's very different than the conversation in which, the traditional director is calling the shots at all times, literally calling the shots.
What I was going to say also, or thinking about this kind of the durational aspects of slave play and sort of what that does, linking it to, the way the clinical sort of plays a part, right? And I think it's interesting because every clinical vignette you introduce with, I started seeing this person 4 days a week, and after X number of years, this happened, right? So it's sort of an announcement of that. And I know that you're very careful to be like, this book is not an instruction manual, i.e. you unpracticed people, please do not go and like blow up your relationships. But I think, there's something really interesting about like that, the psychoanalytic longue durée in relation to like the performance longue durée. They're obviously different, but.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that there's something about the durational, and kind of like I talk a lot about repetition, as you know, in the book, and kind of like repetition is something that kind of like in psychoanalysis is very maligned and distrusted, and kind of like it's a degraded form of memory. But in the book, I actually really argue for repetition as something that deserves our commitment, and as the par excellence process by which the ego is broken down. One of the things talking about kind of like, it's not auto theory, as you were saying, Tavia, but I talk a lot about my obsession with a play in the book, and the repetition that I kind of like find myself partly doing and partly being caught in. So there's something about that. And I was also wanting to say something about Claire Warden and this quote about kind of like wanting to be human rather than comfortable, because I think in some ways I would say that what I think this is in Kara Walker, and it's also in Jeremy O'Harris, that they're both very traumatophilic artists. So rather than do art that tries to kind of like drain trauma out and repair, and kind of like find some way to work through something, they go right for the jugular, and they're looking kind of like what they are both inviting us to do is actually linger in the trauma and establish a relationship with the trauma, which is what kind of like I think about traumatophilia, as opposed to all of these traumatophobic approaches that we have both in our culture and definitely in our field, where the idea is you encounter trauma and the idea is like, how do you take it away? But trauma is also, however difficult and disruptive, it also shapes us, it also makes us. Once you've had it, like it's in your flesh, it's not going anywhere. So then the question becomes, what do you do with that? And kind of like, as I'm saying flesh, of course I'm thinking about spillers, right? And kind of like the notion that kind of like that can be extracted in some way is just, I think, absurd. It's absurd to me that we say that to our students, that we say this as clinicians to each other, and that we even imagine we can do that for patients. So both of these works, I think, and kind of like, especially like the repetition of being exposed to the side of trauma, I think raise questions about kind of like, what else can we do with trauma? Kind of like, what happens when you encounter pleasure or intimacy or kind of like objection, racial objection? Like few things are as hard as that, to watch it, to find yourself laughing at some of the jokes and then kind of like catching yourself and then wondering both about the catching and about the laughing. Like it's kind of like, it's a very confusing experience. And rather than clarity, it offers you an opportunity to feel both implicated and also confused. And that I think that we really underestimate the ethics of confusion and of disruption.
Do we want to take questions? Is that, I'm just noticing the hour. Or do we have questions? If not, we can, or we.
It does not look like we have any questions in the Q&A.
There is a question.
Welcome to. There's a comment in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
If you'd like, you can address that.
Shall we read it? Tavia, you're.
I think the idea was that I and or Amber were to read it. So I have the mic, I guess I'll do it. The first one from Alex M. Thinking about, I hope this is a question, it's in the comment. Thinking about sites and acceptance. Oh, it's just a comment. Okay, so it's not a question. But maybe we can read it aloud. Thinking about size and acceptance of challenging internal experience that are necessary to maintain a meditation practice. It is not comfortable. It is close to kink and traumatophilia. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So, free associating as someone who does have a meditation practice, I guess I would say I recognize that a little bit. I feel seen in that idea that the repetition and meditation allows you to kind of go over, let's say, obsessive thoughts in a way that destigma, that moves them around a little bit. But maybe we do have a question, so I'll save my meditation practice for another venue. I joined a little late, but would love to hear about La Planche and how that might show up. Apologies if this was covered. I don't think it really was covered. I mentioned La Planche in my opening, but do you want to say more about how this approach to traumatophilia draws on La Planche? And maybe if I could, well, actually, I'll ask a follow-up after you take that question.
I'll say this really briefly so that I don't spend like the 2 hours that I would like to talk about La Planche. So what I would say is that La Planche has an unusual psychoanalytic theory in that, contrary to most psychoanalysts, he starts with the premise that that our subjectivation is actually contingent on traumatization, on a particular kind of trauma that has to do with the other sexual incursion into us. And by sexual incursion, I'm not talking about sexual abuse. I'm talking about how the parent in their ministrations of their infant introduces inadvertently, because of their own sexual unconscious, enigmatic content that is undecipherable. And in the way in that kind of like enigma lands on the psychophysiological skin of the infant, the infant is kind of like now saddled with a problem, like what is this that just happened, and we'll never be able to answer this problem. So Laplanche says that this is kind of like the originary trauma, and it is in response to trying to cope with the strain of that incursion that the infant becomes developing a psychic apparatus, so that we become subjects in Laplanche's theory through trauma from the get-go. So that is very different from theories like Freud's, who start out with the premise that there is an organism that has to protect itself from overwhelming stimulation from the outside, but there is something initially intact that then has to be kind of like guarded. And this has a lot of parallels with thinking, I think, both about affirmative consent and also whiteness, like this fantasy of original intactness that is assailed from the outside, but is ontologically unbroken and should be unbreakable. And in some ways, I think that, like Laplanche is ideally situated and kind of like to help us take traumatophilia very far, because he does not start out with this premise that you are unbroken or that you deserve to be unbreakable. The question is what happens with the break in the aftermath of being kind of like interrupted and of being intruded and invaded. So it's a particularly fruitful model for thinking about that. And he touches, traumatophilia is one of his terms. He uses it very briefly and doesn't do very much with it, but I think it's extremely exciting. And that's why I kind of like develop into a whole concept.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? That's really helpful. And in particular, because, again, I learned a lot about Laplanche. Not only did I learn a lot about Laplanche from your book, it's probably fair to say that everything I think I know about Laplanche, I learned from your book. Certainly not from Laplanche. And I love this idea. It's really enabling generative. I guess we could sidebar at some point about the enigmatic signifier and its potential relationship to some other kind of maybe even quasi-esoteric psychoanalysis, the Torok and Abraham enigmatic word. But that's not the question. My question is, there's a sort of more orthodox in the academy or in like critical theory version of psychoanalysis, and that's the kind of Lacanian strand, right? And there we get, in contrast to the theory of infantile sexuality that you just presented, what, for instance, Joan Kropchak calls the like diphasic onset of sexuation, which holds that there's an experience as infants that we don't understand. And then, that adult sexuality is about going back to that traumatic, understanding it, and that that's the diphasic onset of sexuation. And what I've always thought myself about that theory, although it is a theory of infantile sexuality, I suppose, or a relationship between infantile experience and adult sexuality, I was always like, why just two? Like, why was there like a one-to-one? I mean, I guess I'm sure Lacan had his reasons, but one, if maybe this is too far afield, just ask generally speaking what a Laplanchian approach gives versus this more orthodox Lacanian. And then the other is, I don't know if for the audience, for the conversation, there is when we think about this account of infantile sexuality, I think, of course, about Daddy, his other play, what's going on about this time, and the ways in which that play is it in some ways could be read as participating in a more familiar, even mid 20th century kind of psychoanalysis, Freudian regression, but I'll stop there because it seems like we have a number of questions.
I'm going to very quickly respond to what you said, Tavia. I think it's very interesting because this, and I think I also have a theory about why you have this question, which I think is kind of like related to the answer I want to give you. So when you're talking about this biphasic, kind of like you have it, you don't understand it, but then you go back afterwards, after you have maturation, after you have sexuality, and you're like, ta-da, now it makes sense. What this does not allow for, which Laplanche is very committed to, and kind of like in this, kind of like I'm very helped by Glissant's thinking, is that kind of like opacity is completely gone. Where like the idea is you don't understand something because you're developmentally not there yet, but it is understandable. Maybe later you'll come back and figure it out, right? But what is fascinating about Laplanche is that the enigmatic is ontologically opaque. So it's not about interpreting it. It's not about understanding it. It's not about maybe later you'll understand somebody's motives. You're kind of like stuck with that opacity forever. And that is actually terrific because that is also the guarantor of our psychic freedom. It means that you can never be completely understood or completely understand somebody else. And kind of like, you know, this line of thinking, I think, is extremely compatible with thinking with Glissant and with some kind of like work in queer of color critique.
I'm going to take up some of the questions. So I think following on this, opacity seems to be, I'll just say, I think opacity is part of this answer. But the question is, you've discussed many of the keywords in the title, but can you say something directly about consent and its beyond?
Yes. I'm trying to think about how to do this quickly. So affirmative consent gives us, or at least promises, over-promises, as many people have already critiqued, kind of like good sexual politics, sexual pleasure, and of course we know that it has spectacularly failed. So the question is, how else might we think about consent? And one of the things that I take very seriously in the book is beginning to think about consent not just as an interpersonal process, like I consent to you touching me this way, or you can't touch this, but you can touch that word, but not this word, but also to begin to think about consent as an internal process. So the person who is sitting in the audience of Slave Play, or who sees kind of like the Sphinx and is feeling upset, whatever that upset is, kind of like, what is it you're walking into your encounter with art or in your encounter with another person expecting, and what happens? So usually we're concerned about kind of like the boundaries being kept. You get what you signed up for. But I think that a lot more interesting is the question of like, what happens when you encounter that which you did not expect? And that opens up something in you. And how do you respond to that something, to this new appetite, or to this new kind of like confusing, excited anxiety? And this is not something that you can consent to. You have no idea what you're getting into. And a colleague of mine shared a very interesting moment, a very interesting clinical moment with a patient, and I'm sharing this with her permission. I shared this yesterday too, because I just love this vignette. She was talking about having been working with somebody who became extremely difficult in the treatment and was saying really difficult things to her. And she was speaking to her analyst, and she said, she was telling me that she had said to her analyst, I didn't sign up for this. Like, what is this? Like, I didn't sign up for being treated this way. And she told me that when she was reading the book, she thought for the first time, but neither did he. Neither did my patient. Neither of us signed up for this. And this is, I think, what's like really so striking about intimate encounters that are not on the level of identity. They are more about kind of like, once you step into relation, you don't know what's coming. And the question is, do you stay in it and do something together? Do you step out of it? What do you consent in yourself, and what comes up in the encounter with your opacity, not the other's opacity, but also your opacity?
And I think a follow-up is going to be, what are thoughts on the zeitgeist, push for trigger warnings, content warnings in light of Beyond Consent?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know from what angle to take on this question, but like, do we give them? Like, is the question about whether we give them, about whether they work? Like, I think ultimately they don't work. Like I'm thinking of what you were saying, Tavia, about kind of like feeling kind of like slapped by an experience of reading, kind of like reading Freud, right? Like what kind of trigger warning would have anticipated that? And would we want that? Like, of course, you might have read something that leaves you feeling traumatized, but this is the risk of reading. This is the risk of an encounter. This is the risk of an exposure to art. So that's what I would say about that.
And then are there elements of your argument that you anticipate being particularly at risk of being misunderstood or misread?
Yeah, totally. I mean, definitely what I'm saying about limit consent, I think can easily be kind of like twisted or kind of like turned into kind of like not being mindful of borders or inviting violation, especially because I make a very intentional point about alerting the reader constantly that when you step into this territory, there are risks. This is not a, oh, you're going to go in there and you're going to feel slapped and expanded. Like you could go in there and feel traumatized, and difficult things can happen. So it's less about guarding oneself and risking experience. And I think that takes a particular kind of reader and sensibility to be able to stay with. Definitely what I'm saying about race play is not easy. Kind of like the way that I work with that, the idea of kind of like thinking about kind of like the attraction to the side of trauma, especially racial trauma. Especially in the last chapter, I also have some kind of like thoughts about how would a white partner participate in that? What about the ethics of that? And I don't go at it from the perspective of kind of like what one might expect, and kind of like try to go at it from a different angle. But I'm sure that these are arguments that might be taken in different directions than I mean them to go.
So I'm wondering about what you mean when you say watching slave play as entertainment would miss the point. I resist the idea that there's a right way to engage with slave play. Isn't part of what we're saying is to submit to the ethical sadism of the play? That also means allowing the experience to unfold organically, which would include having a lighter, playful, being entertained response, as well as being freaked out, triggered, angry, aroused, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify that. I wasn't suggesting that I wasn't giving notes on how to watch slave play. I was, if you're going in and giving yourself over to that, and entertainment is what happens, if that's what you encounter, that's different. Like that is exactly what I am talking about. It's more about like watching it in the way that one consumes, like, I don't know, like when you sit on the weekend and kind of like binge on a show just to pass your time. That's the kind of thing that I was talking about. I wasn't talking about like not. I think that the play is enjoyable in some ways. And that I would think of as a resistance to the play, as a refusal to actually let yourself be taken over and see how you're taken over.
And then this one, thank you for your answer on La Planche. Love reading the understanding of trauma into thinking about race. I also here feel some rhymes in Avgi's understanding of trauma with Anzaldua's relationship to traumas of race, belonging, border. If any of the speakers are familiar with Anzaldua, let me know if anyone else is seeing that or any thoughts. I have thought, okay. I think that's a great, I think there are definitely, I think one of the interesting things about this book is that a lot of these thoughts around how racialization works on this kind of pain pleasure axis, and sort of like the necessity of porosity really for understanding oneself in a racialized way are things that have been discussed by women of color feminists. But what's unique about this book is putting that into the language of psychoanalysis and really using it as a framework for understanding how one can be in the world. So I absolutely, from my perspective, I think there are definite resonances, and it's striking to sort of like see that perspective brought into this other sphere. I don't know if you guys have.
was just going to say it's very exciting to hear you say that, Amber, because part of what many of us are struggling right now with in psychoanalysis is the way in which race is welcomed, and I put this intentionally in quote, as kind of like as an expansion of the field, but without really regenerating some of our thinking so that it can actually be undone and done differently. It just becomes kind of like more inclusive, which ultimately keeps nothing, kind of like it keeps everything static. So I'm excited to hear kind of like that kind of link. So thank you.
Okay, and then the last question is, can you say more about how your book and the concept of traumatophilia specifically is a protest against attachment theory?
So attachment theory, I'll say this briefly because I know we have to stop. Attachment theory is kind of like, let me start with this. There are different strands of psychoanalytic theorizing that think with, some of which think with infantile sexuality, and some of which think with attachment, the attachment relation with a parent, usually the mother, usually in a nuclear family, usually white, usually middle class. Kind of like how in that context, secure attachments come about, emotional regulation. So it's attachment theory is really about the production of obedient subjects, of disciplined subjects, and of white subjects independently of their kind of skin pigmentation, right? It's about kind of like a certain kind of whitening of the subject. It kind of like its emphasis on kind of like emotional regulation, on being able to kind of like stay with feelings rather than kind of like have anger, have kind of like these exuberant expressions of affect, which are very much pathologized, like up to a point, but not too much. And part of what I'm arguing in the book is, I mean, in many ways, the book is a manifesto for too muchness and for kind of like what happens kind of like when more, kind of when one goes into the land of more and more, because what we're told, especially when you're training as a clinician, is that what goes beyond too much is a breakdown. And part of what I'm saying is bring it, like things can happen out of these breakdowns. And it is us clinicians who hold our patients back when we traumatophobically say not too much, let's not go there.
I know y'all could have like kept going, and so I feel bad ending, especially since the questions really started rolling in. Thank you, Amber, for handling all those questions, and Avgi, I know you had to like compress what could have been so much more. What a fantastic book, and thank you all so much for turning out tonight. Tavia, your prepared remarks, I think really speak to just what one can take away. That one, you had to reveal a confessional from your reading experience. I wouldn't be surprised if many others who pick up Sexuality Beyond Consent have a similar experience. As someone in the Q&A just asked, it's included in the chat for everyone who attended tonight. In buying Sexuality Beyond Consent through Greenlight Bookstore, as a thank you, enter coupon code Greenlight Events, plural, the number 10, into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off as a thank you for attending tonight's virtual event. Congratulations on your book, Avgi. Really, thank you.
Thank you for hosting us, and thank you, Amber, and thank you, Tavia, so much for these, like such a delight to be in conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Yes, buy the book. Have a great night.